Ahoy, shipmates. I'm recording this on the Cape of Good Hope at the southernmost tip of Africa on New Year's Day. Ahead of me across the sea is Antarctica, and to my left, to the east, is the Indian Ocean. To my right, to the west, is the Atlantic Ocean. And these are the waters where, in myth, the captain of the Flying Dutchman made an infamous vow that was to doom his crew to forever sail the seven seas. And the sea, its myths, and the supernatural is the theme of this special nautical New Year's edition of the Bureau of Lost Culture, where we leave behind our usual waters to set sail into the past and a very unusual subculture, even counterculture you could say. Welcome, I'm Stephen. For most of human history, the sea has been both a road and a riddle. It promises fortune and freedom, but it also swallows ships whole. And in the 18th and 19th centuries, as Britain's empire spread across the globe, the sea became seen not just as a physical frontier, but as a psychic one too, a vast, perilous deep where faith, science, fear and fantasy collided. This is the story that the British cultural historian Karl Bell tells in The Perilous Deep, a supernatural history of the Atlantic, a wonderful study of sailors' lore, ghost ships, ghost stories, sea monsters, omens and uncanny maritime experiences. It's not just a history of battles or trade routes, but of dreams and terrors, of the sea as it existed in the minds of those who sailed upon it. So, climb aboard. Let's set sail. Welcome, Karl, to the Bureau of Lost Culture.
Thanks very much, Stephen. Thanks for having me.
Tell us a little bit about you and about your work.
My previous research as a historian has been looking at the connection between environment and supernatural beliefs. Previously, most of my research has been focused on cities and kind of challenging the idea that when we started developing modern cities in the 19th century, we all became rational and we all dumped all of this kind of supposed supernatural ideas, showing that the urban itself generates a need for the supernatural as much as the rural. And so that's kind of where I've been working. And then increasing, because I'm based in Portsmouth, I've sort of tilted towards the sea and the ports and that type of stuff.
For any listeners who don't know, Portsmouth is a maritime city on the south coast, and certainly in previous times a very, very important port, you know, when the British ruled the waves, right?
Yeah, it's still a naval base. They don't kind of have the kind of the dockyard working, you know, it's kind of become a heritage centre now rather than a functioning place to repair the naval ships. But it is still essentially the home of the Royal Navy in the UK.
You mentioned then, Karl, your previous work and about the urban and the supernatural. And of course, you've actually written about Spring-Heeled Jack, mythical, fabulous monster creature that haunted the streets of London, or allegedly did, right?
Yeah, this kind of urban demon, you know, kind of, if you like, sort of early Victorian urban legends. Everyone saw him, but it was never actually anybody. It was always a friend of a friend type thing in most cases. But yeah, this kind of fascinating figure that just grows right from the early years of the Victorian period and is continually cited right through to the end of the century, even into the early 20th century.
Definitely a story for the Bureau at some point. So let's talk about The Perilous Deep. It's a supernatural history of the Atlantic, but it's within a particular window, and it is to do with the British mind, isn't it? I mean, I'm sure that a lot of the themes in the book are shared across the sort of maritime world and probably predate it and post-date it in history, but you did focus on this particular window of time and this culture, right?
Yeah, that was a very deliberate choice. The 19th century in particular, as a period in terms of technology of obviously from transitioning slowly from sail to steam, these two things coexisting alongside one another for a very long time, actually. That kind of prompts discussion at the time. This stuff is fading. As we move from sail to steam, then the technology itself kind of negates the reason for why people held these ideas. So kind of what I wanted to do is kind of explore what happens there. You know, do these things persist? Or as I kind of suggest in the book, in many cases they adapt. The technology gets updated, but the supernatural ideas, haunted ships, phantom ships, omens, all of this type of thing is very much updated and continues. And there's kind of an interesting question about why that is the case. Is the 19th century sort of rhetoric about technology conquering nature is clearly not the case when you have to spend lots of time at sea in a potentially very dangerous environment. It doesn't matter that much whether you're on a steamship or a sail ship.
It is the time as well, I suppose, or it covers the time when Britain, when the empire stretched from sunset to sunrise, and the British Navy was the sort of most powerful military force and sort of trading force in the world. When I'm guessing that in terms of the number of people, passengers, and the number of goods that were being traded and wars that were being fought, a lot of it was actually at sea, right?
Yes. I mean, this is kind of, particularly when you're thinking about the transatlantic world, this is kind of the peak time when you've got European immigration to America. And so it's, increasingly you've got all these cultures mixing and sort of transitioning back and forth across the Atlantic. And they're carrying their stories, they're carrying their beliefs, they're carrying their gods. So it's kind of an interesting, very fertile area in which people are moving around, bringing their stories with them, encountering new stories, and it all gets kind of churned up into this interesting transatlantic maritime culture.
All you've got to do is get out on the sea, as I'm sure you know, for a little bit and realize that it's still incredibly powerful, whatever our technologies are. It's a huge threatening thing. And that's, in a sense, the background to the book, isn't it? That, seafaring is seafaring as well. It's the sea as this, almost like this being. That was the background to a lot of the myths, a lot of the beliefs, superstitions, you might call them. And the whole culture is that when you're actually out there, it's this elemental force and it is mysterious, right?
Yes. Our understanding of the sea really doesn't go much beyond the coast and a sort of perhaps a pleasant paddle at, the beach or something like that. You get beyond that. You get beyond where the sort of the land drops out from the horizon and you are surrounded purely by this vast expanse and unknown depths of water beneath you. It encourages the imagination. It enforces the sense of your own smallness in the world, your insignificance. And that kind of projection onto that space as something that is far larger than human, sort of non-human entity or sentient, that type of thing. It's how you end up creating maritime gods, I guess. There must be some reasons for why storms happen, why some ships make it, why some get sunk. And that kind of, you then start to sort of anthropomorphize it into gods and goddesses who are angry with you or they're benevolent or whatever it may be. There's that kind of projection going on that you find in ancient cultures, and it does kind of come right through to 17th, 18th, 19th centuries.
Yeah, so it needs to be respected, but also there's a possibility that it can be propitiated in some way.
Right.
That the respect can turn into some sacrament or some sacred device or ritual, which can kind of like placate the elementals, can guide your way to safety.
There's always, it seems, a strong sense, an awareness that although we can adapt and survive at sea, it's not our natural environment, obviously. And therefore, we're intruding into a space, a realm that isn't ours. And therefore, there has to be respect. There has to be perhaps gifts offered. There has to be rituals respected. Trying to navigate, not through maps, but sort of psychologically navigate the confrontation with this huge space. It gives, but equally it can take. And it's kind of walking that knife edge all the time.
What was the spark for you that made you want to explore this supernatural history rather than, the more traditional maritime histories, which is battle and trade, basically?
I was aware that there was a very rich body of kind of maritime folklore and myth and legend, but I'd never really considered myself like a maritime historian. But I was also aware that this hadn't really been looked at in a very developed way. There's obviously been sort of work on it, but it seemed that it was also a good time with issues of the environment coming, I think, to the forefront of our minds ever more, looking at how people have engaged with the environment in the past, but through the supernatural lens, through the imagination and to an element through fantasy, perhaps. Then I think that was a different but interesting perspective to take on.
So for the sailors, for a sort of a typical sailor during this period, this perception of the ocean as a sort of conscious being, did it shape their sort of everyday life and psychology?
Yeah, there is this culture aboard ship and before people get aboard ship of ritual and omen and observing the natural world for signs of what may be coming. And in most cases, it boils down to, is it going to lead to a thunderstorm? Is there going to be a shipwreck? Am I going to drown? That was the underlying fear, that ships, however sturdy they may be, can be torn apart on rocks by the sea, can be broken. And when you're in the middle of the Atlantic, you're stuck. There is that kind of anxiety. And this is the way in which the various rituals and omens and practices and observances, all of those are ways of trying to hope that you have some influence over that environment, that you can nudge things so that your luck holds, that you can avoid bad luck. And that's kind of what it's coming down to. It seems to be there's no rhyme or reason as to who sinks, who lives. that kind of seems very deeply grounded in people's psyche, if you're a seafarer.
There may be some sense of fortune telling about, say, the time to leave port, or not, to predict whether there's some catastrophic storm coming. The book's full of these things, and they're actually fascinating. There's one particular one which is fascinating to me because I've got a personal connection with it. It tells about the call, which is Cauls, and what that was and what that meant to sailors at the time.
The coil is very much like a piece of, sort of sympathetic magic, if you like. The coil is the membrane that a baby sort of grows in when it's in the womb, and it normally sort of breaks just before the birth. And it's supposed to be very good luck if a baby is born with the coil intact. And these membranes were then taken and sort of dried and sold onto sailors, because the thinking was if they protected a baby in the womb, then they would protect a sailor from drowning if they're in the water. And so there's, in the 19th century, newspapers are advertising these things for considerable sums in many cases. Sometimes people are known to have them sort of sewn into their clothing. So this idea that you'd never be without it, therefore you would never drown, and these can be passed on. There's not always a logic to it as to whether it's yours, whether it should be allowed to dry out or not. But that essential magic token, a totem perhaps, that would protect you, it gave you a sense of perhaps comfort. It gave those who had perhaps given it to you ashore also a sense that you were protected magically through having a coal in your possession.
My mum told me that her granny, or possibly her great-granny, which would be my great-great-granny, they had a coal, I presume from one of the children that she gave birth to, and they kept it between the pages of the family Bible.
Right.
Obviously her granny must have told her about it, but the strange thing is that every now and again there'd be a knock on the door and it would be a sailor. Sailors would come to ask if they could buy it. They didn't sell it, and I don't know much more about the story apart from that, but I heard this story when I was a kid, and it seemed quite creepy,
When was this?
I guess that would be, if it was my mum's great-granny, I guess it would have been, end of the 19th or something. It was quite late on, I think, I don't know what happened to it. The Bible's still there, but it's not there anymore. It must have been known in the neighbourhood, or somehow known that they had this thing. Because a sailor would show up every now and again trying to persuade them to sell it.
When you look at how much it kind of converts to, I think in sort of modern day in money, it's perhaps several hundred, possibly even thousand sort of pounds for this, which is no small amount of money to pay on something that it's getting to this idea of, is this just a kind of an old tradition that's left over, or is there genuine belief here? And if you're going to make that sort of investment, it suggests that perhaps there is some kind of genuine belief behind it. And if you're saying if people kind of keep turning up, it's clearly, it's not just individuals. There's a kind of a sense of lots of people knowing about this. So interestingly, there's an article in the Folklore Journal from during the First World War where they'd noted that the price of coals had been going down, suggesting that belief had been dying out. And then once you get the development of submarine warfare in the First World War, the price start going up because suddenly people are looking for anything, magical or not, to improve their chances again.
Yeah, that's just one of the things which you talk about. I was fascinated on the dark side again by this concept of the Jonah. Tell us about that.
Yeah, the Jonah is the kind of the person who's identified as the reason why things are going wrong on a ship. So essentially, they're a scapegoat. If there's accidents on board ship, if there's kind of a prolonged period of really bad weather, the crew are all kind of stuck on this vessel, all feeling anxious, start to look at one another and kind of working out, well, whose fault is it? Who's causing this? And obviously, as we know with scapegoats, it becomes a nice, simple explanation for things as well. You don't have to worry about lots of different complex sort of causes. You can just blame it on one person. If we can do something about that one person, perhaps we can solve the problem. This is a dangerous situation to be in if those fingers start to point to you in the middle of the Atlantic, far away from anyone else apart from your kind of the rest of the crew. I would imagine you could feel very, very isolated.
Understatement. Yeah, I'm terrified for sure.
You're very far away from sort of law and order. It's kind of the rule of the ship. There are accounts that, captains also believe this. It's not just able seamen, that captains, perhaps particularly if they'd worked their way up through the ranks, they were still believing the idea of Jonahs. You don't get anybody sort of being thrown overboard, but you do get them sort of being ostracized and having a very difficult time. And it's often associated with, well, perhaps they brought something on board, the taint of bad luck. And it's often, certainly in the earlier part of the 19th century, linked to their behavior ashore. So they seem to be particularly sort of sinful or immoral in some ways. And then they're bringing that on board a ship, and therefore everyone is sort of being punished as a result.
Right, so you could be the unpopular one, or you could be the one who's slightly different in some way. That's sort of the kind of the slightly freakish person, or you could be the bad guy, right? And then you almost like automatically become a focus for people's suspicion because we want to blame somebody, right? And it feels like a magical thing, doesn't it? If it's this totem or it's this person to do with them, it sort of somehow takes the responsibility off us. Kind of, it's like a lightning rod somehow, right?
Yeah, and interestingly, it's often associated with prolonged bad weather. There is that kind of sense that if things seem to be going wrong, and then obviously people start to connect things as well. So not only is the weather bad, but somebody slipped and had an accident, and these kind of things all get conflated into, right, there is something wrong. There is a force on board the ship that is generating bad luck, and therefore we need to get them off as soon as possible.
You know, these beliefs, they might be dismissed at the time and certainly subsequently as superstition, but you talk about them more as a sort of pragmatic toolkit for managing these extremely tense situations.
There's kind of the distinction to be made there between people sitting in their armchair back in London are writing about these things, and then how people out at sea are using them. And so I think there is this sort of sense of, well, you know, these are quaint superstitions, and that's the kind of sort of the educated commentators sort of viewpoint of this, quite dismissive, and very, very frequently in the 19th century trying to push it into the past. Whereas people at sea, I do see, you know, that is my kind of reading of a lot of this. It's about psychological crutches. It's about kind of finding ways of getting by and sharing these narratives and ideas that allow that. You know, it allows crews to kind of to connect because they've got this sort of similar body of maritime law. It's kind of a shared culture that they have. It always tilts towards this idea that the sea is greater than we can know. However able we are as mariners, we can never have complete control over it. And therefore, it kind of always tilts towards the realm of the supernatural.
Yeah, you've got this extremely tight, tiny culture. You know, you've got all these bodies pressed into this, what's a fairly small space, right, on board, you know, living cheek by jowl for weeks, possibly months, in some very intense situations. You imagine it being psychologically like a tinderbox in some way, particularly like if the weather, the ocean, the sea seems to be turning against you.
Right. And then on top of that, you've kind of got this very rigid discipline a lot of the time because you've got a few officers trying to kind of keep everyone else under control. So they kind of crank down with really harsh discipline. So all of that is very hard to actually vocalize that predominantly male environment. There's the issues about how do you speak about these things? How do you speak about your anxieties in a way that it doesn't make you look weak? Right. And so kind of talking about it in terms of ghost ships as a kind of a sort of a reminder of those who've gone before and died and your anxieties about all that type of thing. The supernatural sort of becomes a language through which you can talk about things. It doesn't necessarily take away from the idea that perhaps some people did genuinely believe in it. You know, I think we'd be in danger of reducing it too much if we just said, well, this is a coded language for they're scared at sea. But there is a lot of that behind this.
Also, I mean, apart from the Jonah, I mean, you mentioned it then, it was a predominantly male environment, and women and, interestingly, priests or sort of ministers were sort of regarded as bad luck on board as well, right?
Yeah, it seems their main association is with death. It wasn't anti-clerical as such. There's kind of interesting hints in the sort of the sources that because they are involved with burials, they've got this association with death. And anything that is tainted with death, sailors don't want it on board. They don't want to carry bodies on board. They don't want clergymen on board. There's then also the sort of theological issues of sort of particularly perhaps countries that believe sort of in an interactive devil, you know, in the world. They will target clergymen rather than sort of lay people. And the sailors are going to get caught in the crossfire. So
right.
Clergyman at sea, this is a perfect opportunity to kill him by sinking the ship, but it's everyone else on board that is kind of going to go down with them. Added to that, there sort of seems to be the association in some sort of hyper-masculine sailor sort of view that clergymen are also quite effeminate. And so they're different and they stand out from those around them. And so that's a whole combination of things do seem to make them very prejudiced against having clergymen on board ships.
And women too.
It's expected that women should launch ships, but then they shouldn't be on board. That's taken to be unlucky as well. For this, I could not find a decent explanation as to why this is the case. But they, you know, other than being a predominantly sort of male environment, this idea that perhaps there's very practical issues of a woman would be a distraction on board ship. You know, men may not have their minds on their work quite as much as they should do, and therefore you could have accidents, breakdown of discipline, those type of things.
Yeah, rivalries.
Right. The way it would disrupt those predominantly sort of homosocial relationships that exist on board a ship.
As Karl says, women were not welcome on ships. Yet here is a sidebar about some who've managed to sneak aboard. Mary Read and Anne Bonny lived during what has become known as the Golden Age of Piracy, a brief period in the early 18th century when the Caribbean was crowded with privateers turned outlaws, and the boundaries between war, crime and commerce were often blurred. Mary Read was born in England around 1685. As a child, she was dressed as a boy by her mother in order to secure a small inheritance. The disguise remained useful. Mary served as a footman, then as a soldier in the British Army, fighting in Flanders during the War of the Spanish Succession. Only later, after falling in love with a fellow soldier, did she reveal her sex. After his death, she returned to wearing men's clothes and went to sea. Anne Bonny was born in Ireland around 1697 and raised partly in South Carolina. Accounts describe her as intelligent, quick-tempered, and unwilling to submit to authority. She married a sailor and small-time pirate, James Bonny, but soon left him, drawn to the pirate community of Nassau in the Bahamas. Mary and Anne met aboard the pirate ship Revenge, commanded by John Calico Jack Rackham. Both initially concealed their identities, and both were accepted as full members of the crew. When the ship took prizes, they fought alongside the men, armed with pistols and cutlasses. Witnesses later testified that they were often amongst the most aggressive in battle. But in October 1720, the Revenge was surprised and captured by a British naval vessel off the coast of Jamaica. Most of the crew were found drunk below deck. Mary Read and Anne Bonny were on deck, resisting capture. At their trial in Spanish Town, Jamaica, both women were convicted of piracy and sentenced to death. But execution was delayed when each claimed to be pregnant, a legal protection known as pleading the belly. Mary Read died in prison the following year, probably from fever. Anne Bonny disappears from historical record. Some reports suggest she was released or ransomed, others that she returned quietly to a private life. Not all of the women who disguised themselves as men to get aboard did so with such villainous purpose. Margaret Thompson left her uncle's home and joined the Navy under the alias George Thompson. When she was busted, she explained that she went through such measures to find her sweetheart who had left her. Anne McLean, who was born to poor parents, found it hard to obtain a livelihood when they passed away. Anne had a masculine demeanour, described as being stout and hardy, so she thought she might pass for a boy, and after signing on as a sailor, she did so, although her disguise was ended when an onlooker realised that she was a woman. Lucy Brewer left home to save her parents from shame when she realised she was pregnant and disguised herself as a boy aboard ship. It's thought that the ballad The Handsome Cabin Boy may have been based on her story. It's of a pretty female, as you may understand, her mind being bent on rambling and to some far-off land. She dressed herself in man's attire, or so it does appear, and she hired with a sea captain to serve him for a year. And the captain's wife, being on board, she seemed in great joy to think her husband had engaged such a handsome cabin boy. And now and then she'd slip him a kiss, and she would have liked a toy. But it was the captain found out the secret of this handsome cabin boy. Her cheeks, they were like roses red, and her hair lay in a curl. The sailors often smiled and said she looked just like a girl. But eating of the captain's biscuits, her colour did destroy, and the waist did swell of pretty Nell, this handsome cabin boy. It was in the Bay of Biscayne that our gallant ship did plough. That night amongst the sailors was a fearful flurry and row. They tumbled up from the hammocks, and their sleep it did destroy, and they swore about the groaning coming from this handsome cabin boy. "Oh doctor, dear, oh doctor," the cabin boy did cry, "my time has come. I am undone, and surely I will die." Well, the doctor came a-running, and smiling at the fun, for to think a sailor lad should have a daughter or a son. Then the sailors, when they saw the joke, they all did stand and stare. This born child belonged to none of them, they solemnly did swear. The captain's wife she says to him, "My dear, I wish you joy, for it's either you or me has betrayed this handsome cabin boy." And then each man took his tote of rum, and they drunk success to trade, and likewise to the cabin boy, who was neither man nor maid. When we're there when the ship leaves, ships were often referred to as she,
Yes.
and in fact, the sea is referred to often as
Yes.
she. Why was that?
I mean, obviously, that was also perhaps compounded by having a figurehead that was also, it sort of personifies the ship as well when you have those, because they're often female, they're often mer creatures and sort of blending of the human and the fish type thing. Again, this may be a certain amount of kind of sort of 19th century and perhaps earlier attitudes to kind of gender qualities, if you like. The idea of the masculine as rational and ordered, and the idea of the sea kind of reflecting that idea of sort of volatility and emotion, and which is associated in their mind with the female. It reflects some of the quality as they see it or as they project it of women.
And of course, the kind of creatures of the deep, probably the most famous one is the mermaid, right? You got Siren, you got the mermaid, you got the Selkie, all female figures of some sort. And you talk about the mermaid, embodying the ocean's sort of dual nature. It's both alluring and super dangerous. And the mermaid's a fascinating creature, isn't it? Because, it comes into science as well later on, doesn't it? How did that evolve, and how did the mermaids sort of, reflect their anxieties in this strange, terrifying world?
I mean, the mermaid has got very sort of murky, complicated sort of lineage. There's not a neat tracing it back, but it kind of, you've got it there in ancient cultures. You've got it there in sort of the Syrian fertility god, who is kind of often held up as one of these first figures of human-fish combination. You've got the sirens, though actually the sirens do not start as kind of mer women. They're often the bird women in mythology. The song, the alluring song, that kind of gets appropriated into the mermaid myth, one of their sort of supernatural powers, if you like. You've got the Nereids, who kind of the female attendants to Poseidon. So you have got these kind of figures who are associated in mythology with the sea, but then they kind of gradually diminish from demigods and goddesses down to these marine beings, and they sort of the fantasies about these entire mer societies. There are mermen, but they're rarer. They're supposed to be very ugly. So the counter to the very beautiful mermaid. There are even a couple of stories of mer children, or so it's a story that seems perhaps to come from originally from sort of symbolism, something that's kind of perhaps trying to capture what would somebody who is kind of both human and got links to the sea, would they look like naturally, symbolically. They would be part fish, and exactly how we get from there, perhaps via medieval bestiaries, where they kind of also sort of showing hybrid creatures, down through into the sort of, as you say, the 18th century, where they sort of say, well, let's start to scientifically question and explore whether there is any validity to this. How can you have something that is so like us and yet absolutely so different at the same time? And, you have cabinets of curiosities where this is supposedly a part of a mermaid or something like that. So even when you've got tangible evidence, there's kind of questionable as to, well, I've got this thing in my cabinet, but is it actually a mermaid or something or not? It's interesting that it does sort of shift into these evolving, particularly 18th, 19th century scientific categories. And people kind of say, well, let's not be too hasty. Science should be able to roam anywhere. And we should be able to question the most fantastical things in mythology and legend. Let's see if there is any basis for that in reality.
And let's face it, I mean, there's extraordinary things in the ocean, so why not?
Yeah, the thing that you can always get away with the ocean is, however much you think it's so big and so deep and so unknown that there could always be things that we haven't seen before. And so it can always be added onto the end of your list of known things. There's always that sort of, this goes beyond what we know, but there's the possibility that we just haven't seen more of these merfolk yet.
The merfolk, are just one of them, aren't they? In this part of the world, the Selkie, the seal woman,
Yes.
Woman on land, seal at sea, is a super strong myth. And of course, out on the spit here, when the seals gather, which they do, and they start sending out their call, it's quite eerie, and it has got this otherworldly, singing to it. So you can very easily imagine how that, would tie into a belief about something supernatural going on there, right? But what about some of the other creatures, kraken, incredible monsters of the deep?
It's kind of typically seen as like a Scandinavian monster, but there are also references to it in sort of Roman mythology as well. So it's a creature that is so large that no one's ever seen the whole thing. It's that type of thing. It essentially ends up embodying, it represents the ocean. And yet, by the 19th century, people are still talking about the Kraken, but it's kind of being diminished, and it is being kind of almost shoehorned into sort of scientific categories. Back in the 18th century, it had Carl Bell, a kind of famous botanist, and I'm trying to put everything in boxes in terms of categories. He had mentioned the Kraken as a possible creature, and yet then he sort of dropped it later, quietly sort of shuffled it out of the schema that he had created for it, because it's got these tentacles or horns, but no one's ever really seen it, so you don't know exactly what it looks like under the water. There are these legends around sort of Norway and Sweden of fishermen going out and sort of water levels changing because the Kraken is rising, and that's when you have to row like mad to get out of the way. So there's those kind of legends, but they are becoming diminished, and ultimately the Kraken itself seems to get sort of levered into the category of it was a giant squid, which itself had been a sort of semi-mythical being up until then. But it's in the 19th century where they start to really come up with proof that it does exist. And then it becomes a case of mistaken identity.
But the idea is there's monsters out there. The ocean itself is monstrous. Terrifying things must have happened. I mean, obviously sailors would know what a storm is and they would recognise that. But there would be something terrifying, almost as though you're being attacked as well, right? And in some way to sort of embody that, to give it a physical form, is kind of quite understandable, really.
Yeah, and particularly the sort of the mention of tentacles is that kind of the alien otherness of the sea. It's not hands, it's not arms, it's tentacles, which are themselves both sort of weird and revolting and kind of also symbolic of the sea monster, if you like. And particularly, I think, because squid and octopus have this idea of sort of intelligence as well. There's a sort of a calculated menace possibly behind this. It's hunting you, which is obviously also quite a reversal of fortunes if you're used to being a fisherman going out to hunt fish. The Kraken's coming for you. And it is a reminder of how small and sort of pitiful you are in their environment.
Right. And I mean, some of them would have actually also had experience of seeing, huge whales as well. So the idea of an absolutely vast creature, out there, and of course the whales themselves could be very dangerous too, couldn't they, to a sailor? Yeah. So that's completely understandable. You mentioned it already, and of course one of the fascinating things is the ghost ship. We know about the Flying Dutchman. There's something about that legend, isn't there, that's sort of particularly spooky. And of course, through recent films and stuff has become sort of embedded in our cultural consciousness. Tell us about that and the notion of the ghost ship.
Yeah, I mean, there's kind of, I think, two sort of different things there. The ghost ship is clearly always a reminder of the past and those who've gone before you. The fact that, if you think about it in a very kind of cold, calculating, detached way, every time seafarers went to sea, they were crossing over the graves of those who had died before them.
Right.
They're still in the ocean somewhere, as are the wrecked ships beneath them.
When somebody died at sea on board for whatever reason, they were always thrown over the side or buried at sea. They weren't kept on the ship until they got back home, right?
But again, for those reasons, they were normally buried at sea, particularly if it's a long sea journey. You have the idea of sort of weighting the body. Particularly, I think if you're on perhaps a military ship, you might have cannonballs which could sort of be tied to your legs. Even with that, there is always a sense that these were the restless dead. They were not settled. They were not fixed in the ground as you would be if you were buried on land. And therefore, that kind of restlessness of the sea, restlessness of the body in the sea, I mean, it creates these stories in particular of ghosts returning to shore. They make their way back and then they sort of turn up at the front door of their loved ones, which is sometimes a romantic thing. Sometimes it's kind of a sense of closure. Obviously, it could also be frightening because they tend to turn up and looking drowned as well. Yeah. So there's that kind of thing, but a sense of connection. It worked the other way as well. When a loved one would die on land, sailors claimed they had perhaps sometimes seen them on board ship. So there is an emotional connection between those coastal communities and people ashore. And then ghost ships, particularly the Flying Dutchman, it's kind of very elaborated. It does seem to have began as sort of, in terms of sort of folkloric legend, but it accrued all these different, perhaps the most famous things like Wagner's opera, so he kind of added his bit to it. Before that, you've got sort of Penny Bloods, this kind of cheaper fiction where they're elaborating upon the story. But it has got this strange biblical quality to it as well. This Captain Van der Decken, who's trying to get round the South African Cape, and he encounters this storm, and rather than stopping and just going into, we'll wait for it to pass, he kind of sets himself hell-bent on testing himself and his crew and the storm, to the point where the Holy Spirit is supposed to come down and materialize on board the ship and say, stop what you're doing. And even then he tries shooting it, which leads to him being wounded. And then he's sort of more or less damned from this point onwards to sail forever, never allowed to go to port, always hungry. It kind of echoes some of the stuff from Pirates of the Caribbean, but perhaps without the squid face.
It is a super, super creepy thing. And also then that brings in the religious aspect as well. Not only does he find nature by sailing into the storm, but then he defies the Holy Spirit. And I suppose Christianity did play a part in this as well, didn't it? Where was the role of prayer and stuff for the sailors, to propitiate, not only the creatures of the deep, but in the ocean itself?
Religion does play a part, and it also creates tensions between sailors as well. If they're from different countries and different religions, and again, they're often multinational crews, they're all thrown into a very tight space together. One of the things you can see the kind of the folkloric, legendary stuff doing is kind of sitting above that. It kind of takes away from people being too pious and too perhaps religious to sort of dampen that with the shared culture that they can talk about.
There wouldn't have been that many situations when you would get such a multicultural mix as you would in port and on board, right? In this country, there'll be people from literally all over the world in the ports and actually on the ships, right? Bringing their own beliefs with them.
Yeah. Again, I think this is part of the sort of the glue that binds these crews together. Because even then, the crews don't sail everywhere together. They come together for a particular voyage, perhaps. They go to where they're going, and then that'll be it. They then get another contract, go somewhere else. They have to keep reformulating themselves into crews. And so having something that sort of binds them together, this sort of the folklore of the sea, if you like, becomes a way in which they can talk to one another about the ocean with sort of a shared language that perhaps sits above some of those divisions.
I mean, in terms of, say, the stories, the legends, the ghost stories, the Flying Dutchman, the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, their fears about, say, killing an albatross and birds carrying the souls of dead men, etc. Was there a storytelling tradition amongst sailors on board? Because you have to be entertained as well as working all the time. So what role did entertainment and these stories play in that, and in terms of bringing, these disparate cultures together as well?
Yeah, I mean, there is certainly, storytelling is cheap. If you've got nothing else, if you're a good storyteller. Again, there's an example in the book of a young French boy who goes to sea, and he's a cabin boy, and cabin boys are often sort of targets of bullying because people would sort of punch down on the most junior member of the crew. And so one way which he adapts and survives, works his way into the crew, is to share his body of knowledge or his stories that he'd picked up from seafarers who his farm he'd grown up on. It allows you to sort of ingratiate yourself into sort of that crew. It can alter the pecking order. So even though there's kind of a strict hierarchy of ranks within a crew, the person who's actually got the stories, it can be a sign of your age and how much time you've spent at sea as well. It's a way of, again, talking about, well, I've seen things that you haven't seen, and talk about krakens and sea serpents and mermaids. There is the idea of people have got to keep themselves occupied as well. When they're not working, when there is that downtime, and when there's not many resources in terms of stuff on board, sharing stories is a way of entertaining one another, but also talking about the environment that you're working in at the same time.
On the subject of stories, you talk about this concept of fake lore, and then this brings us on shore in a way, because part of the book is about the shore and the sea, right? That maritime folklore wasn't just created at sea. There were coastal communities, the families left behind, the people who owned the ships, the whole industry around the port as well. That also shaped the beliefs that the sailors sort of took with them on board, right?
If you look at commentators' views of sailors' supernatural beliefs, they want to present it as something that kind of just festers on board a ship. It's something other, it's something remote, and it's created at sea. Whereas actually, if you look at it, there are huge numbers of connections between the coast and the land and the sea. A lot of this maritime lore is learnt ashore. It may be different if you were sort of a transatlantic sailor, but if you're a fishing community, you've grown up in that community. As you're a child and as you're growing up, you absorb all of this lore and rituals and routines and why you should do this, why you shouldn't do that. And then you take that to sea with you. So a lot of the prepping for this kind of magical supernatural thinking is often done within the coastal communities before you even set foot on a ship or on a boat.
Here is a sidebar with some of the personal charms, beliefs, omens and taboos that sailors held to be valuable and to guarantee their safety aboard ship. First of all, personal charms and magical protections. Coins under the mast, a tradition dating back to at least Roman times, placing coins, often silver for its protective qualities against witchcraft, under a ship's mast was thought to bring good fortune, encourage wealth for commercial vessels, or ensure a good catch for fishing boats. The practice was so ingrained that it continued even into 20th century naval ships. Horseshoes on the mast. For general good luck and to ensure safety of the vessel, many sailors would nail a horseshoe to the mast or sternpost, with the ends pointing upwards. And this practice gained immense popularity after Lord Nelson reportedly had one fixed to the mast of HMS Victory. Objects from the sea. Sailors would often carry natural items like fish bones, coral or dried seahorses as personal protective charms, imbuing the objects from this dangerous environment with the power to protect them from it. And second, omens, reading the signs of the sea. Rats leaving the ship. This is one of the most enduring omens. While it had a pragmatic basis, rats would free a ship that was taken on water and therefore was likely to drown, it was universally seen as a powerful portent of doom. Birds as souls and portents. Seabirds were rich with supernatural meaning. Gulls or albatrosses were often believed to contain the souls of drowned sailors. Killing one, as famously depicted in the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, was thought to bring terrible misfortune and condemn the ship. Stormy petrels, also known as Mother Carey's chickens, were seen as harbingers of dreadful storms. Sharks and porpoises. Porpoises were considered lucky and a sign of good weather, and harming one was forbidden. In contrast, sharks were omens of death. They were believed to have a supernatural sense, following ships that carried a dying person or were soon to suffer a fatal accident, that they might feast on the corpse. St. Elmo's fire, an electrical weather phenomenon which causes a glowing plasma to appear on the high points of a ship. It was interpreted in various ways. Some saw it as a good omen, a sign of a patron saint's protection. Others believed the lights were the souls of the drowned trying to return to their ship, and if the lights descended the mast, it foretold a terrible storm. Misfortune was seen as a contagious force that had to be actively managed and contained. We've heard about the Jonah. But there are also unlucky days. Starting a voyage or launching a ship on a Friday was considered extremely unlucky, a belief tied to Friday being the day of Christ's execution. Other unlucky days included the 1st of April, April Fool's Day, and the 31st of December. That was yesterday. Forbidden words at sea, particularly amongst fishermen, certain words were taboo. Scottish fishermen would avoid saying minister, kirk, pig or salmon while at sea. They would use euphemisms instead, like calling a church a bellhouse for fear of jinxing the catch or inviting bad weather. And lastly, there was the peril of saving the drowning. In one of the most callous seeming beliefs, fishermen in Shetland and Cornwall believed one should not save a drowning man. They feared that cheating the sea of its victim would require it to take another life in recompense, often that of the rescuer himself. Also, of course, very anxious times for those left behind. You know, your father, your brother, your son, you know, your uncle has set off and, you know, he's making a living out there and hopefully going to bring some of it back. But is he going to bring himself back? That would be a perennial worry, wouldn't it? Because people wouldn't come back.
No, that's right. I guess going along with that, your involvement in being responsible for that in some way. You know, have you encouraged your son to go to see, if something then happens to them, how you live with that guilt as well, which again, I think feeds into some of those coastal ghost stories of returning.
There's a terrifying image in the book, actually. It's by an artist called Thorvald Niss, and it's called The Drowned Man's Ghost Tries to Claim a New Victim for the Sea. It's from the late 19th century, and it's this terrifying image of a skeleton sort of dragging what looks like a sailor, trying to pull him back into the sea. And I guess that would be it, wouldn't it? This darkness and this fear, and also the hope, because obviously the hope is that, you know, you're going to come back with money, possibly with more. This terrifying mix of hope and fear all the time.
There's kind of a shortish chapter in there about sort of enchanted lands, and that sort of becomes another part of sort of psychologically dealing with this, is rather than imagine them essentially just floating around somewhere in the water, this idea that, well, perhaps they've found this enchanted Eden. They're okay. I may never see them again, but they're safe and they're okay. And that sort of becomes a fantasy, rather than confronting the idea that they died, that they're living on some enchanted island, which they can perhaps never get away from, may not want to anymore, but at least they're alive.
Yeah, that's a rather kind of beautiful myth, isn't it? This notion of these, you know, mythic lands out there. There's obviously Atlantis is the very famous one, but
Yeah.
there's High Briesel, is it? Which is off the west coast of Ireland. And people literally said that they'd seen it. Even there's some stories that people had actually been there, right?
Yeah, it was on maps.
Mm.
It kept moving around on the maps, but it was on maps. And so that kind of gave it a little bit of, I guess, sort of credibility. There are these ideas of it appears every 7 years off the west coast of Ireland. Obviously, sort of rationalists always kind of say, well, it's just sea mist and fog and, it looked like land from a distance or something. So there's always those who want to dismiss it. But there are these attempts to kind of claim that people had visited it. I think they're largely disproven, but as with a lot of this stuff, the appeal is so great that people don't want to let it go.
Yeah.
And so even if you can say, well, perhaps it isn't real, I want to pretend it is, I want to imagine it is. High Brazil people are still talking about it into the late 19th century. It does seem to sort of fade by the time we get into the 20th, but there's certainly people claiming to have seen it. A green land, magical connotations. When a crew mysteriously found it, they light a fire, and it's apparently the fire is the thing that sort of breaks this magical spell that keeps it invisible. They come back with great wealth. There's sort of various stories of like the Enchanted Island. It seems to be like sort of those 1970s sort of Doug McBlure films.
It's got this possibility of some wonderful land, if only we could get there.
Yes.
And then it's also got this other thing, which is more poignant, is that if your father, son, brother, husband has disappeared, this hope that they are out there somewhere, and happy and alive on some mystical land. Talk about fake lore, these tales invented by smugglers to keep people away from areas.
It's kind of the basic plot of every sort of Scooby-Doo episode, isn't it? Really, it's but it is that type of thing. It's about trying to scare people away from things. So you do get these coastal stories, particularly in places like Cornwall, stories involving sort of mysterious lights on the beach, which they kind of claim to be the spirits of the dead looking for their bodies, may have washed up. Or there's one about the Lady of the Lantern, where she's looking for a child. She survived a shipwreck, her child was lost. And then after her death, she continues to look for this lost child on the beach with a lantern. And to see her was to kind of to be an ill omen. Something bad would happen to you if you saw her, so therefore stay away. It matches very nicely with the idea that there's also smuggling. This is where stuff's coming into the country. People working on, but you want to keep them away.
Mm.
There is people suspecting that sightings of a black shook, this sort of giant demonic phantom dog on the North Norfolk coast, was actually a pony that smugglers had dressed up to look horrible, give it a lantern with one single eye. Same thing, if you saw it, you're going to die soon, so stay away from these lanes where it's been seen recently. And yet these lanes are also supposed to be where the smugglers would sort of run kegs of alcohol. There is this idea of kind of deliberately faking these kind of supernatural stories. Obviously, there's the bigger question behind that of, it's very hard for us to get to the truth of any of these particular stories, but these seem to be sort of manufactured for a purpose. How effective that would have been or not, because the supernatural can scare people away, but equally it's very attractive. People are drawn to it.
Right.
How successfully that would have worked if you knew that there was a ghostly lady of the lantern walking around on the beach. Would that keep you away, or would that encourage you to actually go and look for her? It's not a clear-cut thing.
The fake lore itself becomes folklore, doesn't it? Because then people tell stories about people faking it and then it turning on them in some way. And that leads us on to sort of more into the kind of, the cultural consequences of this world. You trace a line from these sailors' yarns and to the nautical horror. There's William Hope Hodgson, isn't there, an H.P. Lovecraft classic, with squid-like creatures and stuff. And they sort of took this supernatural dread of these aquatic creatures and sort of turned it into, what we call the weird, right?
Yeah, there's kind of an updating going on there. There's a need to move away from the supernatural as it was understood, but to kind of keep the horror element to it. So they both kind of draw upon the unknown of the deep, and they're sort of projecting onto what could be in the deep in a way that tends to emphasize biology and science rather than William Hope Hodgson in particular. He's got this fascination, also at the same time revulsion, about sort of physical transformation at sea, the way in which that environment changes people or changes ships. He talks, there's one about the stone ship where it's kind of a calcified ship that comes up to the surface briefly. People go and investigate it. Essentially, it's kind of like a haunted house story at sea, but it's kind of all then explained away at the end. So it sets it up as a sort of a supernatural thing, then sort of deflates it in a way with a sort of the rational explanation. But his kind of stuff about sort of fungal horrors, people are being transported, or humanity has been sort of eroded as they become more and more a fungus or a mold and these type of things, often triggered by something in the environment, the marine environment. There's horrors, but they're no longer supernatural as such. They are weird. And Lovecraft does the same sort of thing. He doesn't really pandered particularly to the supernatural. Cthulhu is essentially a Kraken-type size-type creature, but then also a sort of cosmic being. We just didn't realize what we thought about the world. We didn't know genetic traits, that type of thing. Your true inheritance isn't what we think it is. You're not human. But it's kind of being updated to sort of the more modern, in this case, sort of late 19th, early 20th century concerns or horrors.
Right. And then, of course, the many modern monster movies, Godzilla, The Abyss, The Meg, with the monster emerging from the deep. These films are a sort of continuation of the same fears and fascinations, aren't they, really?
Oh, yeah. The ocean has really become a place for us, and perhaps it always has been with when you think about the Kraken and sea serpents. This is where we project stuff. If you don't know something, then you can imagine anything, if you like. There are no bounds on that. It's the giant creature that emerges, often to sort of stomp around for a bit and then go back. It's kind of the wilderness reminding it it's there, and it will have a go at civilization. Normally New York is a sort of a symbol of Western civilization thing, or Tokyo, it's always sort of the urban confronted by the maritime. You get that with Cloverfield sort of recently, I think, which also sort of possibly spacey, but at the same time comes out of the water. There's an interesting element to those, which kind of hints, I think, our changing relationship with the ocean, is that we're often the bad guys in most of those stories. In Godzilla, it's largely, us messing around with atomic powers, which we're perhaps not really aware of the consequences of what we're doing. With The Abyss, the aliens are sort of nice and sort of purpley shiny, like, it's all very close encounters type thing. Whereas it's the sort of the paranoid military SEAL team going down, they're the danger. A lot of this is starting to come back to, we should sort of question ourselves and what we're doing rather than aliens or monsters. They're not necessarily as monstrous as we think they are.
We still live in a time when with tsunamis and floods where the ocean is impacting, catastrophically on land and on our urban conceits, right? And given, climate change and, the destructive impact that we're having on the ocean itself, these sort of reminders that actually it's much more powerful and its potential is much more destructive than we can kind of really get our head around, right? I mean, that's still the case, isn't it? Karl, for you, in terms of this deep dive into this wonderful, rich and sort of freakish at times world of folklore, what was there one particular unsettling story or belief that you encountered that really got to you?
I think the most shocking one, it's a Jonah story. It kind of also illustrates that this stuff isn't just tradition or it's kind of fading away. It seems to emphasize genuine belief. And it's a murder case on board a ship in, I think it's November 1866. There's this Swedish carpenter's assistant, he's called Charles Anderson. He becomes obsessed with another member of the crew being the reason why they're suffering these storms. And he comes down from the watch one night and basically takes an axe and chops this bloke the head off almost. He kills him in his bunk. They kind of arrest him. This trial goes to the Old Bailey. And so it's in the newspapers, sort of the London press in particular, in 1867. And he kind of claims that if he hadn't have killed him, they would have gone onto the rocks. The ship would have sunk because he thought he was a Finn. Finns were associated with bad luck and witchcraft in the maritime world.
Somebody from Finland?
Yes, it is Finland. But in the 19th century, they don't seem to always be talking about the Finnish. I'm not sure if they're sort of referring to other sort of ethnic groups within Finland that are associated with magical beliefs, witchcraft.
It goes to the Old Bailey, and what happens?
He's found guilty and initially sentenced to death. And then I think they convert his sentence to something like transportation, so he doesn't actually get killed. But just the brutality of it, they sort of said that it nearly took his head off with these axe blows. And just the kind of the sheer, you could blame it on sort of insanity or something, but there's nothing in the backstory to suggest that. He had this reputation for being sort of slightly odd, talking to himself and muttering, but kind of generally harmless. In terms of Jonah's, seeing himself as the hero in that situation, it was very, very grim. And yet it does seem to say something about the power of belief. This isn't just fantasy for some people. This is about survival.
Right. The one that stuck out for me, I have to say, was whistling. I've always assumed that, sailors would be going about their business whistling, but in fact, whistling was a carefully controlled act, right?
Yeah. Again, this largely goes back to sailors and sail, but it's the idea that it would provoke the wind.
Right.
Again, so there's sort of sympathetic sort of resonances between what you're doing and what the wind would do. And so if you're whistling, there's this idea that the wind, again, like the ocean being sentient, would see it as a challenge and would kind of pick up. is really sort of looked down upon if you whistled, very much disapproved of. And again, those sort of managing crew members, making sure other people didn't whistle.
Apart from when the ship was becalmed, then it might be okay to sort of softly whistle, to sort of gently coax a breeze, right?
That's right.
And the other thing was scratching the mast, which is a Scottish thing, I believe, which is that by scratching the ship's mast with your fingernails, you could summon up a wind.
Yeah, both of these are about trying to sort of calibrate. If you overdo it, you're in trouble, because then you're going to get some sort of huge gale, which is going to be dangerous to the ship. Yeah, certainly becalmed to kind of get things moving again, perhaps acceptable in those situations, because becalming itself created its own worries about moving, particularly if you're a sail ship, and you've only got a finite amount of water on board and so on. Sailors see themselves as kind of so insignificant in the face of this mighty environment. And yet the merest little act of whistling creates a response from it. That also seems to sort of show that you've got an incredible amount of influence over what's going on around you.
We want to feel that, don't we? We still want to feel that we can do things which make a difference in the face of danger, particularly when it comes to survival.
Yes.
Echoes into the 20th century and even into the 70s with the Bermuda Triangle. I don't know if that's still a thing, this notion that there's this patch of sort of sea where there's been this extraordinary number of disappearing ships. I mean, is that still a live myth?
Only compared to the 70s, you don't hear so much about it. I think the US Coast Guard have really pushed hard on the statistics to show that there's some dangerous waters, but I don't think it's any necessarily more dangerous than other sort of dangerous waters. There's not an exceptional amount of, ships lost or planes disappearing. They are still going on in that region. There are still sort of planes that have gone down in that area, I think as late as sort of 2017, 18. But I don't know if people are any longer sort of associating them with trans-dimensional portals or Atlantean laser weapons or whatever it was at one point.
Shame. Karl, finally, has anybody ever solved the mystery of the Mary Celeste?
The Mary Celeste, when you start to sort of look around it, it seems to be a bit like sort of Jack the Ripper. So like people don't want to solve the mystery. They like the mystery to remain intact. There's kind of stuff that suggests that it was just a tragic accident. One of the lifeboats was missing. This idea that everything was set out. Apparently a lot of that comes from a later Arthur Conan Doyle story, which is based on the Mary Celeste story. But I know it's in the newspapers, but there's not actually that much sort of supernatural speculation until later. And then a little bit like the Bermuda Triangle, it sort of retrospectively gets picked up as part of a sort of a new age, paranormal, were they abducted type idea. There was even suspicions of the people who had sort of salvaged it had kind of been involved, a bunch of ne'er-do-wells or whatever. The actual supernatural element, or even the idea that perhaps they'd been attacked by some giant squid or something. There wasn't really much to support these many theories that have grown up around
We
it.
still, as you say, want to believe, don't we? And in some ways, when it comes to the ocean,
Yes.
maybe that's quite wise. I suppose the final thing for me is that the ocean itself, in psychological terms, has become associated with the unconscious. The psychological unconscious in Jungian terms, where monsters lie, you could also sort of say there's beautiful sea creatures as well. But it is this analogue, isn't it, for our own unknown and uncontrollable urges, passions, forces that, to this day we have got very limited control over.
Yeah. Those resonances between the sort of the psychological urges and the ocean itself as tides and currents and the darkness underneath, it does speak to those analogies. Given a lot of things we've been talking about here, that you can see it isn't just a body of water. It does speak very much to the mind, our imagination, particularly, I think, as we've said, it's the unknown, volatile nature of it. All of that creates a sense of trying to search for explanation and understanding and ideally some sort of agency where you can navigate your way through all of them.
So it remains the Perilous Deep. Karl, thanks very much for coming to the Bureau of Lost Culture.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Thanks to Karl. I'll put a link to The Perilous Deep, A Supernatural History of the Atlantic, in the show notes. It's full of wonderful, strange folklore and stories, as you can imagine. It's a book about how people used story, art, faith, and science to make sense of the infinite, and how in doing so they reveal their own depths in a realm where gods, monsters, and men all met. I was really fascinated by this maritime micro counterculture. Sailors from around the world living cheap by jail, sometimes for months in this relatively small world. Francis Drake's ship, the Golden Hind, is moored near where I live in London. It shows how small these ships were. It must have been a psychological pressure cooker to live on one, quite terrifying as well if you're out on the ocean in a terrible storm. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I wish you well for 2026 if you're sailing any kind of turbulent seas yourself, and for some peace from the storms that beset this sad old world. Thanks for listening. Let's keep listening. You can find all our stories at bureauoflostculture.com. I will see you down the road, around the bend, and over the horizon for more tales from the other side.